and welcome dear friends. Today we shall discuss concept of stress. The learning objectives of this lecture are understanding meaning and definitions of stress, understanding fight or flight response, understanding types of stress, understanding meaning of stressors, understanding types of stressors, understanding symptoms of stress, understanding effects of stress, understanding different models of stress, and coping. First of all, we shall understand what stress is. The word stress has been derived from the Latin word stringi, which means to be drawn tight, and was popularly used in the 17th century to mean hardship, strait, adversity, or affliction. The term stress was first used in the 17th century to describe the sorrow, suppression, discomfort, and adversity. The term stress had not gained attention in the field of human behavior until Seeley in 1936 suggested using it to describe what will happen when an organism is exposed to an unpleasant stimulus. Hans Seeley defined stress as the non-specific response of the body to any demand. Seeley found in numerous experiments that laboratory animals subjected to acute but different noxious physical and emotional stimuli, for example blaring light, deafening noise, extremes of heat or cold, perpetual frustration, all exhibited the same pathologic changes of stomach ulcerations, shrinkage of lymphoid tissue, and enlargement of the adrenals. He later demonstrated that persistent stress could cause these animals to develop various diseases like those seen in humans, such as heart attacks, stroke, kidney disease, and rheumatoid arthritis. In general, stress may be defined as a state of psychological and physiological imbalance resulting from the disparity between situational demand and the individual's ability and motivation to meet those needs. Different people have defined stress in their own way. Some of the definitions of stress can be summed up as Spielberger defines stress as an integral part of the natural fabric of life, and coping with stress is an everyday requirement for normal human growth and development. Lazarus and Folkman define stress as a pattern of negative physiological responses occurring in situations where people perceive threats to their well-being which may be unable to meet. Skinner defined stress as a reaction of a particular individual to a stimulus event. The fight or flight response. The fight or flight response, also known as the acute stress response, refers to a psychological reaction that occurs in the presence of something that is terrifying, either mentally or physically. The fight or flight response was first described in the 1920s by American physiologist Walter Cannon as a theory that animals react to threats with a general discharge of the sympathetic nervous system, popularized in his book The Bodily Changes in Pain, Hunger, Fear, and Rage. He also expanded Claude Bernard's concept of homeostasis. He popularized his theories in his book The Wisdom of the Body, first published in 1932. Cannon realized that a chain of rapidly occurring reactions inside the body help mobilize the body's resources to deal with threatening circumstances. The sympathetic nervous system responds immediately to any perceived threat and is responsible for arousal. The SNS increases respiration and blood flow to muscles that speed up our escape from danger, activating the fight or flight response. During fight or flight, the body tenses, speeds up, and becomes very alert to deal with any potential threat. In response to acute stress, the body's sympathetic nervous system is activated due to the sudden release of hormones. The sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal glands that triggers the release of catecholamine, which include adrenaline and non-adrenaline. This in turn results in an increase in heart rate, blood pressure and breathing rate. After the threat is gone, it takes between 20 to 60 minutes for the body to return to its pre-arousal levels. Essentially, the response prepares the body to either fight or flee the threat. The response can be triggered due to both real and imaginary threats. Types of stress. The different types of stress are acute stress. Acute stress is the most common among the general population. This form of stress is usually short-term and specific. The cause of acute stress is often immediately apparent. Acute stress is triggered by an imminent emotional or physical threat. This is the type of stress that comes on quickly and often unexpectedly and doesn't last too long, but requires a response and shakes you up a bit. Chronic stress. Chronic stress, in contrast with acute stress, is persistent over a long period of time. This long-term stress usually comes from different life situations, like an unhealthy relationship, living in long-term poverty, or any other miserable situation. People who suffer from chronic stress are most at risk for developing medical conditions related to the long-term problem and can be at a higher risk of attempting suicide. This type of stress may leave an individual feeling drained and can lead to burnout if it's not effectively managed. Episodic acute stress. While a certain level of acute stress is normal, for some people, acute stress becomes a regular facet of life. If an individual constantly feels like he is only one step away from absolute disaster, it can lead to episodic acute stress. Even though episodic acute stress is most often created by taking on too much at one time and doing things that put you in repeated stressful situations, the symptoms can be just as alarming, and this ongoing stressful lifestyle can lead to physical and psychological problems. Emotional stress. The pain of emotional stress can hit harder than other types of stress. For example, the stress that comes from a conflicted relationship tends to bring a greater physical reaction and a stronger sense of distress than the stress that comes from being busy at work. Therefore, it is important to be able to manage emotional stress in effective ways. Strategies that help you process, diffuse, and build resilience towards emotional stress can all work well, and different approaches can work in different situations. We will now discuss Albrecht's 4 types of stress. Dr. Karl Albrecht is a pioneer in the development of stress reduction training for business people. He defined 4 common types of stress in his 1979 book, Stress and the Manager. The 4 common types of stress are: number 1, time stress. An individual experiences time stress when he worries about time or the lack thereof. An individual often worries about the number of things that he has to do, and he fears that he will fail to achieve something important. He might feel trapped, unhappy, or even hopeless. Common examples of time stress include worrying about deadlines or rushing to avoid being late for a meeting. Number 2 is the anticipatory stress. Anticipatory stress describes stress that an individual experiences concern for the future. Sometimes this stress can be focused on a specific event. However, anticipatory stress can also be vague and undefined, such as an overall sense of dread about the future or a worry that something will go wrong. The third type of stress we'll discuss is situational stress. An individual experiences situational stress when he is in a scary situation that he has no control over. This could be an emergency. In other words, it's a situation that involves conflict or a loss of status or acceptance in the eyes of other people. The fourth type is encounter stress. Encounter stress revolves around people. An individual experiences encounter stress when he worries about interacting with a certain person or a group of people. Encounter stress can also occur if your role involves a lot of personal interactions. For example, physicians and social workers have high rates of encounter stress because the people they work with routinely don't feel well or are deeply upset. Now we will discuss various symptoms of stress. Common symptoms of stress on body, which includes headache, muscle tension or pain, chest pain, fatigue, stomach upset, sleep problems, feeling numb, loss of appetite, back pains, weakens immune system. Some common symptoms of stress on mood include anxiety, restlessness, lack of motivation or focus, feeling overwhelmed, irritability or anger, stress or depression, disbelief and shock, tension and irritability, nightmares and recurring thoughts about the event. Common symptoms of stress on behavior include overeating or undereating, trouble concentrating, feeling powerlessness, angry outbursts, drug or alcohol abuse, tobacco use, social withdrawal, exercising less often, and loss of interest in normal activities. Common cognitive symptoms of stress include mental slowness, confusion, general negative attitudes or thoughts, constant worry, the mind races at times, difficulty concentrating, forgetfulness, difficulty thinking in a logical sequence. Now the models of stress. There are three main theoretical approaches for stress. Each one interprets stress different, with a stimulus as a response, as a transaction. Let's discuss stimulus-based models. In these models, the stress is interpreted as a stimulus, a life event or a group of circumstances which may awaken normal or psychological reactions which may increase the vulnerability of the individual to disease. According to Holmes, there are 43 life events or lifestyle changes which can cause stress. According to this theory, both positive and negative life events are considered stressful. Cox termed these stimulus-based models as engineering models of stress. Stimulus-based models assume that after a certain point, there is tolerance to the stress surface, which can result in physical and mental damage to a person. He highlighted that the stimulus-based models of stress postulate that stress reaction or strain occur when external stresses have their action on individuals. Further, he explains that a certain degree of stress is tolerated by every individual because of the development of resistance through learning from such situations and from genetic makeup of the individual for stress. Being neutral to individual difference in the form of cognitive appraisal of the stress situation, that is psychological medication process in the person-environment situation. Let's now discuss response-based models. In these theoretical models, stress is interpreted as a response. The definition of stress as a response was developed and described by Seeley, who defined stress as a non-specific response of the body to any kind of demands applied on it. Seeley's model is called General Adaptation Syndrome. Hans Hugh Bruno Selle, an Austrian-Hungarian endocrinologist, was referred to as the Einstein of medicine for his pioneering contribution to science through his famous theory of influence of stress on people's ability to cope with pressures of injury and disease, called the General Adaptation Syndrome. Hans Selle first introduced the concept of stress in 1939. It is a concept borrowed from natural sciences. General Adaptation Syndrome consisted of 3 stages, which include alarm reaction stage, resistance stage, and exhaustion stage, which are explained as the alarm reaction stage. Upon perceiving a stressor, the body reacts with a fight or flight response, and the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated as the body's resources are mobilized to meet the threat or danger. This stage consists of an increased activity in the sympathetic adrenal medullary system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. Selle argued that the alarm reaction develops 6 to 48 hours. Resistance stage. The body resists and compensates as the parasympathetic nervous system attempts to return many physiological functions to normal levels, while body focuses resources against the stressor and remains on alert. Resistance involves an activity in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. This is when the body is adapting or fitting in with the demands of the environment. However, the body returns to a near normal state if the stress is not too great. The exhaustion stage. The physiological systems used in the previous 2 stages become less effective when stress becomes too prolonged. The early stages of the autonomic nervous system symptoms of arousal reappear. If the stressor or stresses continue beyond the body's capacity, the resources become exhausted and the body is susceptible to disease and death. In some severe cases, the damaged adrenal cortex leads to the failure of the parasympathetic nervous system. Transaction-based models. All theoretical models that interpret stress as transactions are based on the theory of Lazarus, who focused on the fact that there are differences among people in interpretation of stress as a stimulus or as a response. According to Richard Lazarus, stress is a two-way process. It involves the production of stresses by the environment and the response of an individual subjected to these stressors. His conception regarding stress led to the theory of cognitive appraisal. The transactional model of stress and coping proposes that stress is experienced as an appraisal, an evaluation of the situation an individual finds himself in. Specifically, the transactional model suggests that an individual goes through 2 stages of appraisal before feeling and responding to stress, that is, primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. The primary appraisal determines whether what is happening could be harmful, threatening, challenging, beneficial, or of no importance to the individual. Here, individual evaluates the situation to decide if it's relevant to him. In particular, one evaluates whether it will bring about the possibility of gain or harm. If it doesn't, one doesn't worry about it and decides that it is irrelevant. But if it is relevant, he decides if it is positive or dangerous. The secondary appraisal. If an individual feels that the situation is dangerous, he then moves into making a secondary appraisal. Secondary appraisal evaluates the physical, psychological, social, and material resources available to cope with the event. If all other factors are equal, the person who has a strong belief that he or she can handle an event is less likely to interpret it as a threat. Now we'll discuss coping. Coping means to devote own conscious effort to solve personal or interpersonal problems, to try to master, minimize, or tolerate stress and conflict. The psychological coping mechanisms are commonly termed coping strategies or coping skills. The term coping generally refers to adaptive, constructive coping strategies, that is, strategies which reduce stress. In contrast, other coping strategies may be coined as maladaptive if they increase stress. Maladaptive coping is therefore also described when looking at the outcome as non-coping. Lastly, the coping strategies. Wheaton has provided a useful summary for 3 types of coping strategies. Appraisal-focused strategies. These occur when the person modifies the way they think, employing denial or distancing oneself from the problem. People may alter the way they think about a problem by altering their goals and values, such as by seeing the humor in a situation. Some have suggested that humor may play a greater role as a stress moderator among women than men. Problem-focused. People using problem-focused strategies try to deal with the cause of their problem. They do this by finding out information on the problem and learning new skills to manage the problem. Problem-focused coping is aimed at changing or eliminating the sources of the stress. Emotion-focused strategies. These involve releasing pent-up emotions, distracting oneself, managing hostile feelings, meditating, or using systematic relaxation procedures. Emotion-focused coping is oriented towards managing the emotions that accompany the perception of stress. Typically, people use a mixture of all the 3 types of coping strategies, and coping skills will usually change over time. All these methods can prove useful, but some claim that those using problem-focused coping strategies will adjust better to life. Problem-focused coping mechanisms may allow an individual greater perceived control over their problem, whereas emotion-focused coping may sometimes lead to a reduction in perceived control, maladaptive coping. Folkman, Lazarus, Dunkel, Schetter, De Longus, and Groen identified 6 emotion-focused coping strategies: disclaiming, escape avoidance, accepting responsibility or blame, exercising self-control, seeking social support, and positive reappraisal. 2 problem-focused coping strategies. Acting to try to get rid of the problem is a problem-focused strategy, but so is making a list of the steps to take. Lazarus notes that the connection between his idea of defensive reappraisals or cognitive coping and Freud's concept of ego defenses, coping strategies, thus overlapping with a person's defense mechanisms. Dear friends, that was all about today's lecture that we discussed. I heartily thank you for your patient listening and hope that you make the best use of this lecture. Thank you.